think of the war, the Vietnam War, as a conflict that we fought in the country of South Vietnam, and that is certainly true. Most Americans who served in that war fought and served in South Vietnam. But in reality, it was a theater war, and there was, I would say, almost as much combat going on next door in Laos because the North Vietnamese had invested that country with their forces and were using Laos as a conduit to move their forces down into South Vietnam and also into Cambodia, what they called the Trong Son Road, or we call it the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And that was really their road to victory. And if you read their histories, that's exactly what they say and brag about quite extensively. And to deal with that problem throughout the war, we had to deal with North Vietnamese forces in the country of Laos, but we had to do that in a covert fashion. Our special forces operated extensively across the border into Laos throughout the war, primarily along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We also supported Allied forces fighting in Laos, both the southern, central, and northern parts of the country, and to provide direct air support to them with our U.S. Air Forces, our Naval Air, our Marine Air, in some cases even with our Army Air. We had to provide forward air controllers there in the country, and this was done through the use of what we called our Raven forward air controllers. Prior to going to the Raven program, I had been a forward air controller assigned to the 23rd Tactical Air Support Squadron in Kham Phanom, Thailand. Our job primarily was to fly along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, trying to interdict the enemy forces as they were moving south. Also in 1972, the North Vietnamese launched a major offensive operation against South Vietnam with, I want to say, 13 divisions of basically conventional forces. In my squadron out of NKP, for a period of several months, we reinforced our brother FACS forward air controllers at Da Nang, called the Coveys, and we fought extensively against the North Vietnamese forces along the DMZ, in the A Shau Valley, in those places. I volunteered for the Raven program. I was initially notified that I would be going up in country in September. Initially, I was told that I would be going to Pak Se, working along the borders of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But just prior to my going up there, we lost one of our Raven FACs up in the northern area, Military Region 2, in the Plain of Jars area, and I was apparently designated to be his replacement. So I reported to Udon, to Detachment 1 of the 56th Special Operations Wing. I out-processed, if you will, becoming a, quote, civilian, turned in all my military uniforms and ID and everything, and then was transported up to Vientiane, where I reported to our U.S. Embassy. I met with the air attaché. He briefed me into my mission. I got a good intel brief. And the next thing that I needed to do was learn how to fly the O-1. Now, I had been flying the OV-10, which at the time was a fairly modern aircraft. And so for somebody like me, I had to go through a checkout program in the O-1. I had to make 100 landings in the O-1 so that I could handle the airplane on the ground. Of course, when I got checked out flying the O-1, immediately went up for operations in Military Region 2. Got a quick area orientation. I flew with another one of my Raven buddies, a guy by the name of Spike Milam. He took me on a couple missions up there, flew me around the area, got me oriented, showed me how to get into and out of Long Chen, introduced me to the various assets that were operating that area, the CIA guys. There were some DEA folks up there, and I got to meet General Vang Pao. Got a briefing on his area of operations, and very shortly was up flying operational missions as a Raven forward air controller. When I was doing my checkout mission with Spike, we took a couple hits in the airplane, AK-47 fire and also 12.7 millimeter. It was a dangerous area. And with that, I began on literally a daily basis, flying 2 to 3 sorties a day. Because of the threat in the Longchen area, the embassy had dictated that we would all live down in Vientiane, so we had a nice house down there that we rented and enjoyed the culture and the restaurants and the bars and everything there in Vientiane. And then on average flew about 3 missions a day up there in the O-1. I actually flew 2 different types of missions up there. When necessary, if the ground forces needed direct support, I would put in airstrikes around them in what we call close air support. Those were missions where we had to very tightly control the fighters as they were delivering their ordnance in close proximity to ground forces. That's the classical FAC mission they're doing, close air support. Because when you're putting in the airstrikes, there's no such thing as friendly fire. There's no such thing as a friendly airstrike. When we drop those bombs down there, bombs don't care who they kill. They're extremely destructive, they're very powerful, and so we had to do our best to ensure that our ordnance was landing where it needed to land, not harming our friendlies. Secondly, if we were not needed to immediately work around our friendlies, we would go out deeper into enemy territory away from the friendlies, and we would do interdiction missions. And this is where we would go and look for trucks, supplies, troops in the open, whatever we could find to try to hit and destroy those enemy elements before they came in contact with our friendly forces. Interestingly enough, too, on many occasions we would actually have special elements of Vang Pao's troops up doing interdiction type missions themselves, and they would point out targets to us, and so we could be very destructive that way. Also, on many of my missions, I would have a Robin in my back seat. This would be a Hmong or Laotian, or in some cases be a Thai soldier flying with me who was conversant in English, and he could use our radios and talk to our ground forces depending on who we were working with. I particularly remember one day, one of my most effective missions, I was not needed immediately by any of our ground forces, and so I was up northeast of the Plain of Jars, and I looked down and I saw moving from the east, off of the main road, a couple hundred meters kind of up in the tree line, I see a large column of troops moving along. And so I asked my backseater, I said, are those possibly friendly troops? He goes, no, 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 bad guy, bad guy. And so I called our ABCCC there, Cricket, and I said, hey, I've got enemy forces in the open here, and I need some air power real quick. Turns out we had a flight of Marine F-4s coming inbound. This was a unit that had come over in 1972 as a reinforcement of the 72 offensive. They had initially been based in Da Nang, and then they moved them over to Nam Phong Air Base in northern Thailand. These guys were from one of the fighter squadrons there, and I'll never forget, the lead's personal call sign was Smut. So I hear the Smut check too, and they check in with me. I said, what do you got, Raven? And I said, I have troops in the open. And he said, give me a hold down. I'm coming up fast. And so I said, okay, here's what's going to happen now. I'm working along a valley that's basically running east-west. The bad guys are on a ridge line on the south side of the valley. They're moving from the west to the east. And I said, as soon as you come into the area and I put down a mark, these guys are going to scatter. So to achieve maximum surprise, here's what I want you to do. I said, I want you to come in from the north of me, and when you see me, I'm going to call for you to roll in. When you roll in, I'm going to roll in too. I'm going to fire a rocket and pull off, and that rocket will be fairly close, and by that time you should see the enemy troops. He said, I got it all. Let's go to work. So they come up. They're dropping Mark 83 1,000-pound bombs. And he calls the fighter lead, Smut, calls tally-ho on me. And I said, okay, I'm going to start my roll in to the right. He said, go ahead. And I start my roll in to the right. He says, I'm rolling in right across the top of you. I fired my rocket. He said, I see your rocket. I see the enemy. Get the hell out of the way. And they rolled in and made multiple passes on these guys, delivering their ordnance. And we just laid waste to that enemy column that was moving there, trying to hide themselves, but they got caught out in the open, and that's the way it goes. That was a very effective airstrike that day, and I can only assume it was some North Vietnamese unit that was moving into the area. That's kind of the way we worked up there. That's the kind of work we did. And one thing that we did, which I thought was very, very effective, we had what we called our gun kill program. The North Vietnamese forces in that area were augmented with long-range artillery. This could be 122 or 130 millimeter field artillery. And those were very deadly weapons. They were fairly accurate, and they could throw around a long, long way. And they would really do a job on our friendlies. It would terrorize them, and so we really had to make those guys high priority target. So what we did when we were flying, especially working around our friendlies, we would always monitor a common Fox mic frequency. And I recall that frequency was 47.3. Anytime any ground force, if they needed help, they could certainly contact us on that frequency, especially if they started taking incoming. They would call immediately on that frequency that they were taking incoming. And every morning we would get an intel brief that would indicate to us about where those guns were, because we were tracking those batteries very, very closely with our intel assets. So we knew about where to look. So as soon as any of our friendly forces were reporting incoming, all the Ravens would look up to the northeast to the PDJ, where we knew those battalions would be placed. And the guns were always very, very perfectly camouflaged. But there's one thing you can't camouflage, and that's the muzzle blast on those big guns. So the first guy who saw the muzzle blast, he owned it. And he was expected to go right to that gun, orbit over the top, and the next airplanes that came up, support aircraft, fighters with bombs, would go directly to him, and then he would attack those guns. And we killed a whole bunch of those guns that way, and I think that was probably one of the most effective things that we did when we were over there that year. And also, while we were there as Ravens, we certainly supported our ground forces as best we could. But we worked a lot with the Royal Laotian Air Force, especially the Hmong guys that were up there. We had a whole detachment of T-28s, T-28 Deltas. These guys, Laotian and Hmong, got pretty darn good at flying those airplanes. And as much as possible, when we had targets, if we could get them to come up and support us, we would. We'd put them in on the targets. Plus, we also had several Laotian and Hmong pilots who worked with us called Nukatans, and we trained them to be forward air controllers because we knew, quite honestly, that we were going to be leaving this war, and we needed to give these guys every possible skill set that we could before we left. In fact, we got them to be so good, they were actually authorized to direct U.S. strike flights. In fact, I was up one day and we had a flight come in and they were directed to work with one of our Nokatans. And all of a sudden I get a call on the radio from the Nokatan saying, "Hey, 25, I need your help." And I said, "Okay, what's your frequency?" So I came up on his frequency, and this fighter flight, they were very uncomfortable about working with this Laotian or Hmong forward air controller. And I said, "Guys, this is Raven 25. I'm up here. I'm in the barrel. When we're up here, we are the rules of engagement. You are authorized to hit that target, and I'm directing you to work with this Nokatan. He's completely and totally qualified, and he's going to put you on the target." Roger that. So they went to work with this guy. I pulled off to the side and listened, and everything just went perfectly fine. And when they got done, they said, "Hey, Nokatan, you're shit hot, buddy. Great job," as they left the area. So that was another important part of what we did as Ravens. And of course, we got to know these guys pretty well. I knew them all by call sign, and I would talk to them on the ground on many an occasion. And I had one incident. I got to know one of the young Hmong pilots, a guy by the name of Zhongli Tu, and I owe him a great deal. In fact, I have to honestly say that he saved my ass one day. I was up on the PDJ, up in the northeast corner, looking for interdiction targets. And there were quite a number of anti-aircraft guns up there. And it was not unusual for us in our little O1s to see certainly ground fire from AK-47s. You wouldn't see it, but you could, if it hit the airplane, you'd know it. But you could see the 12-7, you could see the 23 millimeter, you could see the ZPUs, the 14.5 millimeters. And this one day, I was up there looking for targets in the northeast corner of the PDJ when a 37 millimeter gun came up on him, and he fired his shells, and I think they were 5-round clips, and you could see the very distinctive airburst coming up. And this guy was just hosing me and hosing me. And you can't go anywhere very fast in an O1. And so I'm doing my best to kind of jink out of the area. Nokatan 502, Zhongli 2, calls me and said, "Hey, 25, where are you? What are you doing?" And I said, "Hey, buddy, I need some help up here." He said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "This gun's hosing me and he won't let me go." And he said, "Well, where are you?" So I told him, and he was a little bit further to the north from me. And sure enough, he comes down, bless his heart, but he sees that gun firing at me, and he rolls in and he fires 2 rockets, which actually hit that gun. Now, the Willie Pete rockets, they're designed to give you a big white puff of smoke, but they're also explosive warheads. And I think undoubtedly he certainly scared the hell out of the crew because they stopped shooting at me, number one. And secondly, he probably damaged, maybe even killed that gun because, again, that's an explosive warhead. And you hit a gun like that and you're going to do some damage to it. So I literally give him credit for saving my ass there that day. While I was there, we lived down in Vientiane. Life was good down there. We got to partake occasionally of some of the nightlife and the bars and all that kind of stuff. But we had to be pretty careful because even though this was an international city, we knew that there could very well be Pathet Lao agents in that area. There were also, we were told, Russian air crews that were flying in. They had a commercial service from there to somewhere in Russia. But it was a beautiful French provincial city and a very enjoyable place to live. We also took our share of losses while we were up there. Again, it was a very dangerous environment. And I had several of my buddies killed while I was there. I was shot down once myself one day. I responded to a ground team that thought they were stumbling into an ambush. They called me up. I went over and checked them out. And sure enough, a few hundred meters ahead of where they were going, I could see troops down there that were digging what appeared to be trench lines or something like that. And so I told the commander, I said, I want your lead man to pop a smoke for me. So he did. I could see exactly where he was. I could see exactly the way the ambush was being set up. And I immediately called one of the artillery battalions, began putting fire on that location. Enemy then started shooting pretty seriously at me, and I started taking the hits in the aircraft. A couple of the rounds actually hit the bottom of my engine, and all my oil leaked out of my engine. And my engine started to sputter, and I realized that I was going down. And so I had gotten a couple tangos up, T-28s up there also to hit the enemy positions. So we beat them up pretty good, but I had to leave. Fortunately, I was high enough that I could glide out of the valley all the way back down to Longchan, and I was able to put the airplane down there. I didn't have to initiate a SAR operation or anything like that. I was very, very lucky that day. But I was going down, and I was fortunate enough to be close to put the airplane back on the runway. And when I got on the ground, of course, all my mug buddies are out there and teasing me and everything and poking their holes through all the fingers through all the bullet holes in the airplane. And I had one round that actually came through the cockpit, and it went right through the back seat, right about there, chest level, okay, that bullet hole. And fortunately that day I did not have a backseater. And when my Hmong buddies saw that, they said, "Oh, 2-5, we want to fly with you. You very, very lucky." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, you take hit, nobody there. We want to fly with you. You have good pee. Okay, we'll figure that one out. But that's the way it was. That was the kind of war that we fought over there at that time. Very, very down close and personal. Like I say, we did lose some guys, two in particular that I would like to relate their stories to you. John Carroll in November was our boss Raven there at Longchan. John was an Air Force major, really sharp guy. And I was on an off day there. I was down in Vientiane. We rotated. We were on about a 6-day rotation, as I recall. So I had a day off, and I'm back at the house in Vientiane, and the embassy calls me and says, "Get down to the airfield quick. Get an airplane ready to go. We have a Raven down." "Who is it?" "It's Raven 20. That was his call sign. Okay, so I beat feet down to the airfield, get an airplane ready to go, throw all my crap in there, and I'm just waiting for the call. And then I get the call that the SAR has been terminated, that John has been killed. Wow, okay, so normally we had working around us all the time up there in northern Laos, we had Air America helicopters and airplanes flying around, and those guys would never hesitate if somebody was down to try to come in and make a pickup. So I got on the phone and I called up to Longchan and got a quick brief on what in fact had happened. John had gone down out on the PDJ, and unfortunately he had landed about 200 meters from an NVA bivouac area, and the bad guys were on him very quickly. So he got down underneath the airplane literally and was trying to fight it out with them. And he made a few quick radio calls. We had a Raven that was in the area, Terry Pfaff. He came in, tried to put together a SAR for him, but the enemy was just already on top of him. But we did have some Air America guys come in, and the crew did hover in and try to make a pickup, but they were shot off the target. And so I waited at the airfield, their Vincian, until they came in and landed. And I went over and I talked to the guys, talked to the pilots, and I said, what happened? And they said, well, we got there. There was a lot of ground fire, and we got in. We weren't too far away, but we could see that John was killed, and we couldn't stay any longer, so we had to pull out. So wow. And so I went over to the guy in the back, the kicker, the guy that would kick the loads out of the helicopter, and I asked him about it. I said, did you possibly consider maybe running over and trying to grab his body? He said, man, the guy was completely shot to pieces. I wasn't going to run for pieces parts. I wasn't going to do it. And of course, that's totally the right answer. I mean, why risk anybody else in a situation like that? So that terminated the SAR. And then that night, through intelligence sources, we got a confirmation that the enemy was reporting that they had recovered his remains. They identified him by name. And so the next morning, since I had a day off, the protocol was I would be the first guy airborne. So I took off and flew up to, in this case, I flew past Longchan, went all the way up to the PDJ to go to work. First place I went to was the wreckage, and sure enough, I could see the O1 down there. I could see bad guys all around it and everything. And so I called in some F4s, and we put up a Mark 84 2,000-pound laser-guided bomb right on top of the wreckage, and we blew it to smithereens. That had an unforeseen consequence later on. Years later, when we had teams going into Laos to try to recover the bodies of our lost, they were still looking for John Carroll. And one of the action officers working for what we now call the Defense Personnel Accounting Agency was doing a case study on John. And I had given an interview like this to Dr. Jane Hamilton Merritt, who wrote the great book about the Hmong Tragic Mountain. And in there, I had mentioned this event, and I mentioned that I had bombed his wreckage the next day. And of course, a bomb of that size will leave a very significant bomb crater. When the DPAA case officer looking at that, they realized that that's what they should be looking for. And based on that, they were able to go to those coordinates. They found the bomb crater. They searched around it, found parts of the airplane, and apparently at some point they also found small pieces of John's bones or something like that to 100% confirm that it was he and that he was lost. And then they brought his remains home, and we buried John here in Colorado at the Air Force Academy because he was a graduate of that school. Not one of my favorite stories, but it was part of what we did when we were Raven Forward Air Controllers. There were numerous of us that were shot down. There were no Raven POWs, none, zero. We had another guy, one of my buddies up there, Skip Jackson, who was lost right after Christmas. He was putting in a strike further up north of the PDJ. He had a midair with an A-7, a U.S. Air Force A-7, hit his airplane. He spun in and crashed and was killed. And the A-7 guy was able to eject, and he was captured and taken to Hanoi. And subsequently, he was repatriated in March of the next year. In early December, I was up working on the north part of the PDJ. We would get, on a daily basis, we'd have strike flights coming up and working with us all the time. Back in the up until November 1972, we would have U.S. Air Force A-1s coming up to us out of Nakhon Phanom. These airplanes would be our search and rescue aircraft, and when they did that, their call sign was Sandy. But these aircraft would also fly strike missions for us in the north, and those were called hobo flights. And they would work directly with us, and they were some of our best close air support assets. But in November, the A-1s were all taken away from the United States Air Force, and they were given to the South Vietnamese as part of our plan to reinforce them as we pulled out of the war. But they stopped operating over there in November and were replaced by A-7s coming over from the United States. A-7 is a lot more airplane than an A-1, and it's more of an interdiction airplane than it is a close air support airplane. They would come up and work with us, and they would come up and they would give us the hobo support. And when we knew that we had hobos coming up, a lot of times what we would do is we would work with our ground forces, such if they were going to do some kind of an exfil or an infill or some kind of a pre-planned strike, we would use those assets for that. But on this particular day, we didn't have anything like that going on. So when the hobos checked in, we didn't immediately need them. So the flight lead, a young captain by the name of Tony Shine, he had previously flown an F-105 tour in Southeast Asia, and he knew the terrain up there pretty well. So he asked for permission to go up around the North Vietnamese border east of Ban Ban and do a little bit of armed recce and see if he couldn't find some moving targets, something like that. And so he was cleared to do that.
I'm standing in the Ban Ban Valley, Muon Kham, Laos, one of the most dangerous places for both the French and the U.S. during the First and the Second Indochina War, looking back towards North Vietnam.
A few minutes later, his wingman called up and said his flight lead had gone down. And in fact, he had been apparently shot down. He'd gone down below a cloud deck, scattered the broken cloud deck, left his wingman up high, and apparently he got hit by something because the wingman reported that he could see burning wreckage on the ground. So obviously the flight lead is down. There's no radio calls, no indications that he had ejected. So number two is a young lieutenant. He's up there all by himself. He's a little nervous, a little scared and everything, but he's got an airplane full of ordnance. So what he wants to do is he wants to drop his bombs and go back to Karat, which was their staging base over there. Fine. So Cricket called me and said, hey, can you work this 1A7? And I said, of course I can. Bring him over here. So he sends him over to me. Then the guy makes it very clear to me that he just wants to drop his bombs and get the hell out of Dodge. Okay. So I see the way he's coming in, and so I start figuring out how I'm going to run this airstrike. And when we would work airstrikes, we had one cardinal rule. When we would clear the fighters in, we did not want to be at the fighter's 12 o'clock when he was pulling up off of his target. And we did that because we knew that he was probably going to be more interested in what his bombs were doing than what was in front of him. So to preclude any kind of conflict, we would try to arrange it to never be at the 12 o'clock. But the way this guy was coming in to me, approaching me, and he was low on gas, he wants to make one pass and go on. So I said, okay, there's going to be a little bit of a conflict here. So what I'll do is I tell this kid, I said, when you pull off the target, I'm going to be at your 12 o'clock up high. So I want you to give me a good hard left turn, and then you'll clear behind me because I'll be in a clockwise orbit over the target. Got to go in this way, and he's going to be going like this. And he acknowledged that. I watch him roll in. He drops his bombs, and then he pulls up, and I'm watching him, and I can see that he has his head turned, and he's looking back behind him to see where his bombs are hitting, and he immediately starts into a very hard right-hand turn. Well, I had told him to go to the left, but I could see in making his right-hand turn, he was going to clear me, so I didn't say anything about it. But then apparently he remembered that I told him to pull off to the left, so all of a sudden he makes a left-hand turn, and now I look down and he's coming right up at me, and I'm looking in my O1, like here, I'm looking right down the intake of his airplane, and it's obviously we're very close to having a mid-air collision here. So my windows are open on the O1. I take the control stick and I push it full forward, which meant I went into a bunt and went over the top like that. And when I did that, all my maps and all my equipment go flying out the window because the windows are open. And his jet goes roaring right over the top of my airplane. He was so close that I could literally smell and feel his jet blast as he went by. But we were clear. That was the good news. And of course, I wasn't too happy about that. And I shared a few choice words with him as I literally chased him out of the valley with every swear word that I could think of. But again, it was just a young kid. I had told him to do something. I had put myself in that position My corrective measure was to give him a deconfliction move. He contradicted it and almost put us on a collision course. So when I got back that day from the flight, I sent a message out to all the other Ravens to watch out. The A7s, they're aggressive and they're dynamic and they do good work, but they're not properly clearing on their pull-offs, and we just about had a midair today. And unfortunately, a few weeks later, my good buddy Skip Jackson was killed by an A7 in a very, very similar circumstance there. As big as the sky is, sometimes it's not big enough. I also had occasion too, and as I have found out through you, we had a number of Thai reinforcements working with the Hmong up there in that area. And I understand now that we had as many at one time as 17,000 Thai forces in Laos supporting the war. Actually, I guess in different parts of the country. I worked with them a few times. Can't remember the specific battalions, but certainly I worked with their artillery battalions. They were firing quite a bit, and even recall once or twice having a Thai actually fly with me in my back seat. Can't remember in any detail, but I treated him just like I did everybody else, and he had me go in, and I think we actually put in some airstrikes that day in support of some of the Thai battalions up there too. So that was another part of that war that just made it very, very unique. I might add too that it was that experience there that made me realize the consequences of this larger war that we were fighting over there in Southeast Asia. Yes, we were fighting in Vietnam, but we were also fighting essentially the same enemy with, local allies. In the case of Laos, it was the Pathet Lao. But I fought the North Vietnamese in South Vietnam. I fought those same units and organization and such there in northern Laos. And later on, when I went back to the Nails and flew in Cambodia, I was fighting them down there too. They were throughout, and they gave great lie to the fact that it was just the Vietnam War. No, it was a conflict across the breadth and depth of Indochina. In my experiences over there, my 3 years over there in the war, I got to see our true enemy in all of those different theaters. Probably the pinnacle, though, of my time in Southeast Asia was the time that I spent as a Raven, because the experiences, the intensity of the flying that we were doing, I have to say that the OV-10 was a great airplane for doing long-range interdiction. It gave you long endurance. It kept you higher above the ground, above the big guns. But for what we were doing up in Laos, working directly with our allied forces, the O-1 was a great airplane to do it. First of all, we flew them either unmarked or with Laotian markings, and that was part of our cover story, if you will. But secondly, the O-1 was a very interesting airplane in that you could fly it with the windows open. That was a very sensual experience, because when you're up there and you're in a fight, you're working with friendlies, you're directing artillery, there's a lot going on around you, you're putting in airstrikes. It expresses itself through all of your senses. You can see it, you can hear it, you can smell it. Sometimes you can even feel the concussion, the blasts and everything. And it really gave you a total situational awareness of what was going on below you. And so, again, for my time as a forward air controller, those 2 years that I spent over there as a forward air controller, those 6 months working directly with our allied forces, the Hmong, the Laotians, and the Thais in northern Laos, was the pinnacle of my FAC experience.